Over the weekend, there was a big strike in Kharkiv that killed 18 people, injured many others, in a grocery store where people were going to shop over the weekend for household goods, ladders, tables, chairs, all sorts of things that you would pick up at a grocery store. The youngest death from the strike that I saw was a 12-year-old girl that was there with her mother. I've seen some people online, mostly just fringe fools with a bunch of just like name, bunch of numbers, which is always where the worst takes on Twitter come from. Those people with name, bunch of numbers right after, no thought put into the username after the time they're botted, trying to say, oh no, there were weapons in the shopping mall. But there's security cam footage. There was journalists on the ground after the strike looking around for any hidden equipment. There is no evidence that there was any military equipment stored at the shopping mall. We have security cam footage of civilians shopping during the time of the strike. No military personnel present, children present, mothers, fathers, and community members present, but no weapons were present. But the Russians struck it, and they ended up killing 18 people, injuring many others, creating the deadliest strike that Ukraine has seen in weeks. And hearing 18 dead, many other injured, and the following sentence being the deadliest strike in weeks, just kind of gives you an image of how deadly these strikes can be once one of these S-300 missiles, one of these Kinzhals, one of these Iranian supplied or now Russian produced Shahed drones, even if they're still based off the Russian models, starts falling into civilian locations, many times in major cities like Kharkiv. But I've also been in the countryside, the area where the Ukrainian armed forces are sending out these pickup trucks with Dushka machine guns loaded up on the back, trying to shoot down these drones out of the sky to try to knock them down before they get into dense urban environments. And in those areas, even the intercepted missiles can still end up hurting people, because it makes sense to intercept them on their way to major cities. But in the countryside, there's still village homes, there's still little villages. And I have been in villages where interceptions have happened above the village, leading to very close calls. I was even in one village home when it happened in the backyard. And so when you have that perspective, this is a horrific attack, but it is one page in a very long book of Ukrainian civilian casualties since the start of this war from the aerial war. And because of this strike, which is not necessarily unique in the fact of how it happened, because there have been previous strikes on shopping malls before, it's just on those other occasions, sometimes it was in the middle of the night when no one was there and it was past curfew, and so nobody really got hurt. Sometimes it was a much smaller death toll, but this isn't even the largest strike that has killed civilians from the aerial war from the Russian side, and this isn't even the first time that they have decided to strike a shopping mall in a major urban center that with no evidence that this is a military target. And so there's a question about whether or not this is A, them trying to hit a military target, missing, and then hitting this shopping mall, or B, they were purposely targeting a shopping mall. Now, all of us probably have an assumption in our mind. The people watching right now have an assumption. I have an assumption. There's a good chance that many of you and many of and me probably have a very similar assumption, but I cannot read the minds of the Russians that launched these missiles. But I could tell you at least the idea behind either possibility. On point A, it's a pretty easy explanation. Point A would be, they tried to hit a target, they missed, and then they hit the mall. It had a bunch of civilians. There's not much of a strategic benefit between in blowing up a bunch of like toilet seats, lamps, and tables. So they didn't have much of a benefit to do this. So this was just their usual recklessness with civilians. Now if that is the case, that would not remove them of any blame. That would simply mean, okay, the Russians were either careless, or they're using old weapons that are not accurate, or they're using weapons that are usually not used for a ground strike capacity and retrofitting them for ground strike capacity, which makes them less accurate. Because if you're retrofitting weapons out in the field, or trying to take, like, for example, one of those old, and this isn't the case here, but one of those ship weapons, like those anti-submarine munitions that are supposed to be used at sea, and you just start lobbing them at cities or start lobbing them at villages, they're not going to be terribly accurate. There's also been complaints about the quality of North Korean shells and their accuracy and how far they've gone off. I've been to sites like in Zaporizhia where S-300 rockets have hit civilian homes, killed civilians, and their lack of accuracy has been noted on multiple occasions. So that's in the first camp. In the second camp, the idea would be either A, ideology has, pushed them to despise the Ukrainians in such a capacity that they're trying to get revenge for the Ukrainians throwing them out of Kharkiv, maybe revenge for the front line in the on this new Kharkiv offensive stabilizing, revenge in some way. Or it could be that the Russian government wants to cause the mass displacement of Ukrainians, causing more refugees going to Europe to apply more pressure on the Europeans, or to make it so it undercuts the Ukrainian economy so they cannot fund the war or break the spirit of the Ukrainians. And considering the air campaign on electricity infrastructure during previous winters, like the winter of 2022, I was in Kharkiv when they were targeting that electrical infrastructure. That is far from completely impossible, that last idea. But right now, we're in completely speculation land, and I want to acknowledge that. And speculation land is speculation land, and you can speculate all day, but at the end of the day, you don't got anything in your hand. All you've got is whatever you're imagining up in your mind. So, after the strike happened, the conversation that came from this strike was just like the conversation that has come from previous strikes that have killed civilians. Just like the conversation around the possibility of a Russian offensive into Sumy, and just like the conversation around the Russian attacks into Kharkiv, about what restrictions and what capabilities the West can provide Ukraine to undermine these types of strikes. And there's two methodologies about this on how you can defend Ukrainian cities. The first methodology is to defend Ukrainian airspace, so that when the bombs come in, the Kinzhals, the S-300s, the drones, the Ukrainians could shoot it down. But in order to do that, they're going to need well-trained personnel who can actually shoot the stuff down. Those who are riding around on technical shooting down the drones, those who are trained on Western air defense systems like the Patriot systems or some French air defense systems or whatever air defense systems they have left over from the Soviet period, and that they'd have enough supply of that Soviet munitions, of those Patriot air defense missiles, of those Dushka trucks shooting down the drones in order to defend their airspace. Now, currently, as of right now, that is not the case. The Ukrainians have some Patriots, Ukrainians have some air defense, but at many stages of this war, we have been in a position where we have gotten reports like the Ukrainians are 2 months from being out of air defense missiles. And then it would be 4 months pass, and then we'd hear again, the Ukrainians are 1 month from losing from not having any more air defense missiles. And sometimes I'd see people discussing it online, like, oh my goodness, what is this scam? I heard a few months ago they only had a little bit left, and now they have basically the same. What gives? Well, what's happening is that they get to a point where they're really low in air defense because Ukraine doesn't have barely any domestic air defense production. And the little bit they do have is mostly concentrated in these technical trucks with old machine guns loaded in the back to knock out drones from the sky. And so they have to rely on Western imports, but they have not been getting nearly enough to fire and hit the incoming projectiles. And while there have been some Patriots provided, there have been some Western munitions provided, not enough to defend cities like Kharkiv. There's Patriots around cities like Kiev, but the Ukrainians have been explicit that they don't have enough Patriots to go around to defend all of their major cities. And while Europe has around 100 Patriot systems, the United States still has other Patriot systems in service. There's even some Patriot systems in Europe, and there's also Patriot systems and Patriot missiles that are still being produced by the companies that produce them. Oh God, I'm trying to forget. I believe it's Raytheon. It's either Raytheon or General Dynamics. I believe it's Raytheon, but I forget. There's like 5 big conglomerates, so I've got 5 guesses: Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, like you get the idea. So the first way to solve it, Ukraine can't right now. Ukraine can't because they just don't have the air defense. Now, if through diplomacy, like for example, the Spanish is going to announce soon that they're going to send $1 billion worth of aid, including more Patriot air defense missiles. If they can get more announcements like that, then maybe this method becomes more feasible. And of course, this method always helps to some capacity, because even if you can't shoot all of them down, if you can shoot 60% of them down, that helps. But until they have a stronger air defense system, whether it looks something like the Iron Dome, whether it looks something like a different air defense system, until they have enough air defense missiles And those air defense missiles are going to be, if we're talking about dragging this out in the long term, inexpensive enough to be affordable. So it's sustainable, so that we're not spending like $100,000 to knock down a $5,000 projectile every time it gets knocked out of the sky. Then this option can become more feasible. But at the time being, until Europe gets more serious about sending more Patriot air defense systems, until the production kicks up, until we have other European systems or other old Soviet systems going to Ukraine, they will operate with the defense systems they have at maximum capacity, but they don't have enough air defense systems to shoot down everything. They don't. They have enough air defense systems to shoot down when they can. So that's the first option. What's the second option? Well, the second option is if you cannot take out the missile, or you can only take out it some of the times, or 60, 70, 80, whatever percentage you want to throw out there of the times when it's coming in, but you want to, you know, disable the threat or at least cripple it more, don't target it when it's coming in at the end. Target it before it launches at you. Target the locations it's being launched from, i.e., like the Ukrainians have, target the ships that are firing missiles into Ukraine, like the Ukrainians have done, and targeting and taking out 30 to 40% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, including its flagship, many carriers, other smaller ships, big ships, all sorts of ships. I'm sure all the little toy model ships you used to see in Battleship, they've taken out a good percentage of those. But outside of that, there's also systems being launched, not outside just the waters next to Ukraine or inside Ukrainian territory, which the Ukrainians can use all of their weapons against, but also outside of Ukrainian territory in Russia.
Bankrupt man.
It's coming from Russia as well. It's coming from Russian air bases. It's coming from Russian artillery teams. It's coming from Russia. And when you're talking about the air bases that are flying jets and flying bombers that are bombing Ukraine and leading to bombings like this, they cannot be targeted outside of with the drones that Ukraine has. And the drones that Ukraine has produced during this war, while they've been able to increase their range exponentially, going from 250 kilometers in range to, I mean, I don't know if you guys saw this recent drone attack that the Ukrainians tried to pull, and they're really messing with, I guess I don't know if you want to call them the escalation crowd, with the type of systems they're targeting. But let me give you an idea. This is the radar system that has to do with Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile defense that was targeted like some 14,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. So yes, they have the ability to launch drones and to do, you know, drone attacks and take out maybe one or two things there. But if you wanted to take out either a gathering of troops that was about to launch an offensive, say, into the Kharkiv Oblast, like was complained about by the Ukrainian armed forces, or as many people are speculating might be happening in the Sumy Oblast in the near future, but that's all speculation, of course. But that concern is creating a lot of dialogue about it. Or if you were to say, wanted to target one of these air bases that had somewhat extensive air defense systems, even if they've been whittled down through Ukrainian persistence and being overstretched over a long areas, they're going to be concentrated on important locations like air bases. And so if you want to get the weapon through and make sure that it's big enough to pack enough of a punch to take out a lot of equipment, the drone isn't going to do it. It's more likely to get knocked down. And not only is it more likely to get knocked down, but it also carries a much smaller payload, where something like an American-provided ATACMS, which has now been provided to the Ukrainians, in what exact numbers I do not know, but are being used against training fields in Luhansk, being used against air bases in occupied Crimea, being used against gathering locations, being used against command centers, being used against all these locations in Crimea that the Russians have been trying to build up the defenses for. But because of the restrictions placed by the U.S. government, the air bases where these type of bombing runs or bombing raids on Ukraine are being done that are leading to strikes like the one on the mall are not able to be struck with these ATACMS systems that would be much more effective in taking them out. And the reason why, as we've talked about on many other occasions, is escalation. The Biden administration and people like Jake Sullivan and also the government of Olaf Scholz, which have stood pretty steadfast on their not sending of the Taurus missile for this concern, are fearful that the use of these types of Western munitions in Russia proper could lead to escalation, with the Russians either trying to escalate in some way. Now, when it comes in reference to Ukraine, there's not much wiggle room for them to continue to escalate. Not saying that there's none, just not that there's much wiggle room. And many of the critics would say, I mean, this is the thing we said about sending them ATACMS in the first place. This is also what we said about Western tanks. This is also what we said about F-16s. This is also what we said about the MiG deal at the start of the war. This is what we said about all sorts of things. And then they got them anyway. And then the doomsday scenarios didn't happen. Why would this scenario be any different? And while there's not a solid answer to why this scenario would necessarily be different, especially if it's being used to target the specific air bases where these types of attacks are being done, and not, say, oil export terminals, which is where you could see a real breakdown of the Russian economic model, which is largely based on the export of natural gas and oil, then I think that the Russians wouldn't be able to escalate to, say, for example, the nuclear word. Because if they were to escalate to a nuclear word, it would do nothing but provoke an immense and almost certainly devastating reaction by the American government, who would be desperate to preserve the nuclear taboo that has developed since after the dropping of Fat Man and Little Boy. And so I'm of the idea that if Russia is getting North Korean missiles, and North Korea is not seeing consequences as they're fired at Ukraine, or Iranian drones, and the Iranians see no consequences when their drones or their missiles are fired at Ukraine, or when Russia uses old Ukrainian missiles that were handed over during the Budapest Memorandum and fired on Ukraine, on top of the Russian missiles, then I don't see what the problem should be if American weapons are used to target specifically the places where these types of weapons are being fired from, which would not only be, I think, tit for tat with what the Russians are already doing, not targeting civilians, of course, but the fact that they're using foreign rockets to strike in Ukraine. Why can't the Ukrainians use foreign ATACMS and foreign weapons to strike the locations the Russians are striking from? But also, I don't believe that the Russians are going to stop of their own fruition. I don't think that there's going to be a point where these types of attacks, like the ones on this mall, are just gonna like stop because we played nice enough with the Russians. Morally, it's been over 2 years, man. And so if the Russians are still a question mark quantity on their respect for the humanity and the lives of Ukrainians, then we cannot just leave it up to the Russians on whether the Ukrainians are going to be treated like human beings, and they have to be given either A, a defensive shield, or B, an ability to take out the weapons that are striking their civilians. So my final point is that the American government needs to get serious about one of two things, or both, which is also a potential option and would probably mean it would be the hardest for the Russians to strike cities like this. But at least one of them, they need to either A, supply them enough air defense, or find a mechanism to supply them enough air defense through NATO or some other collective arrangement, that the Ukrainians will not only have air defense for today and for tomorrow, but for the foreseeable future, so the Russians know that not only do the Ukrainians have strong air defense, but that just randomly firing, for example, S-300s at major cities isn't going to whittle it down to a point where it's going to be strategically beneficial, which is another reason why many people suspect that these types of bombings that end up hitting civilian infrastructure end up happening in an attempt to whittle down Ukrainian air defense, because they don't have enough air defense, they don't produce enough domestically, and they don't import enough. Or, on the other end, take out the source of the problem. Take out the bases where the attacks are being launched from. Take out the locations where the Russians are invading Ukraine from, say in the Kharkiv Oblast, or say in the Sumy Oblast, if that becomes a problem. And if the American government has a problem with restrictions, or has a problem with the idea of escalation, there can still be restrictions placed on these weapons. You can still say, we approve them being used against sites active in the military participation of hostilities, i.e. only air bases that are being used to bomb Ukraine. So no need to bomb an air base that's way out in the middle of Timbuktu that would only be used in the event of a nuclear confrontation. Which could also settle some people about some of these radars that are getting targeted, that intercontinental ballistic defense radars that are really scaring people right now. And you could also put a restriction about oil export terminals to not only assuage concerns from the United States on an international, economic crisis around energy prices, definitely going into an election year, which I think we can say that that's not a contributing factor, but it's impossible to ignore. Russia's own stability, which I mean, I think the American government wants the Russians to back down, but they certainly don't want Russia itself as a state to collapse with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Point is, though, if the American government wants to try to stop things like this happening in the future, they need to get serious about one of these two plans. And it's not just the American government, of course, it's all of Ukraine's backers, but they have to get serious because this will keep happening until there is something to stop the Russians outside of their own conscience. Oh, and by the way, like, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse about these restrictions, being lifted and about the possibility of them being lifted. But I'm not the only person saying this. It's about time that somebody says, like, it's like everyone now. It's the Biden administration that's holding out. It's the Biden administration. It's a Biden issue. This is a Biden issue. I'm done sugarcoating it. This is a Biden issue. This is a Biden issue, Joe Biden issue, okay? This isn't a Republican thing that's holding it back. This isn't a, all of NATO is holding Joe Biden back and they're doing it. Or, oh, this European leader A or B is doing it. It's not Viktor Orban doing it. When it comes to the use of ATACMS in Ukraine proper, Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg is saying, yes, let Western weapons be used to strike Russia where they're striking Ukraine from. It's not just Stoltenberg, it's also the Swedish defense minister who's saying, hey, you can use our weapons to strike Ukraine. That's perfectly fine. From our perspective, it's the Helsinki Commission. Ukraine must be allowed to defend itself. Hashtag let Ukraine strike back. I've seen it from members of Joe Biden's old party, whether it be Jason Crow or others who have started to get up and make noise and grumbling about the fact that Biden should do something. Mike Johnson even said it. Even said, not only was it in the reformed bill that eventually passed, the Mike Johnson version of the Ukraine aid bill, which was basically the same thing with a few alterations. One of the few alterations was you should send ATACMS to Ukraine. And Mike Johnson is saying that Joe Biden should send, not only send ATACMS to Ukraine, but let the Ukrainians use the ATACMS how they please to strike Russia. Making Mike Johnson, who has voted against the vast majority of all Ukraine aid, except for I think the original bills, like the first bill right after the invasion, is more aggressive or stronger on this issue than Joe Biden is. Now, I understand that Joe Biden has reasons for this. It's up to him to be more cautious when it comes to things like nuclear war. And I would prefer caution when it comes to issues like nuclear war in comparison to the last administration with the fire and fury, chest pounding and fist shaking and grumbling about ending the world, or Trump just kind of openly floating the use of nuclear weapons. I would prefer that. But let's also not let caution blur our minds so that it breaks down our support for our allies, and then our abundance of caution becomes the thing that invites the aggression, or the thing that stops the Ukrainians from defending themselves. The Ukrainians striking back when they were invaded is not the breaking of some world-ending precedent that's gonna, oh my God, it's gonna destroy the world, any more than any other state deciding to defend themselves when they're invaded by their neighbor was going to break that world-ending precedent. And so I don't really think that we should be treating this as this tantamount decision that could risk the world's survival. We need to treat it seriously. We need to do it carefully, but time is of the essence here. The Kharkiv offensive shows that you need to make these decisions timely, because you do not know what the next day is going to bring in a war like this.